This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
How old was Abraham really? Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. That's one of the problems skeptics have when they read the Bible. They look at the exceptionally long lives of the patriarchs and say, well, that just can't be, so the whole Bible must be a bunch of bunk. Actually, there are answers for those questions if we care to just but look. Most skeptics are just looking for excuses to not believe the Bible. Joining us to explain this a little more in depth, the gentleman we saw give a presentation on this at the first International Symposium on Archaeology and the Bible that we attended. This would be a year ago, September now, and okay, the overhead light just decided to turn off. Well, that's what happens when you work in a home studio. Anyway, he gave a wonderful presentation on this that helps to explain those ages without resorting to a naturalistic explanation. In other words, without trying to say, well, you can't trust that part of the Bible, because once you go down that slippery slope, you end up creating God in your own image. And that's not what this discussion is about. He is a scholar. He is the dean of the College of Biblical Studies at Trinity Southwest University, which is the school that is leading the dig as we speak at Tall el-Hammam in Jordan, across from Jericho, the site of ancient Sodom. We are honored to welcome to the program for the first time Dr. Craig Olson.
Well, thanks for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
One of the things that I find most fascinating about the response to the work of Dr. Stephen Collins and the team digging at Tall el-Hammam in Jordan, the site of ancient Sodom, in my view, based on the evidence that they presented, from Christians are people like me who've taken the time to try to develop a comprehensive timeline of the ancient world, especially from Abraham onwards. I guess to set the groundwork, how reliable is the Bible, historically speaking?
Well, I think it's very reliable. I think if we believe as evangelicals that the Bible is true, that there should be a correspondence between what the Bible says and between what we know of history and archaeology. Otherwise, it's just a collection of fairy tales. We're not saying that. Now, some people believe that. I get that. I'm not in that camp. I believe the Bible is true. So, but it's not just dates. I'm sure that we'll talk about that. But it's locations, places, events that happened, people, customs that are mentioned in the Bible. Those things, I believe, should line up with what we see in history and culture, our history and archaeology.
So where I run into trouble, then, is looking at the evidence presented by Dr. Philip Sylvia, the scientific director for the dig at Tall el-Hammam, in that they date the destruction of that city to about 1650 BC, give or take 50 years. Now, my extensively researched timeline puts that event at about 1852, and I arrive at that based on dating of the construction of Solomon's Temple, and then backing up to the Exodus, and then adding the ages of the patriarchs and so forth. So based on that, Abraham wasn't born until 1951 BC, which puts the birth of Isaac at 1851 BC. So there's a 200-year difference we need to reconcile. How do we solve that problem?
Yeah, and you're not alone. A lot of people have done that chronology, following in the footsteps of Archbishop Usher. But of course, he was not the first. He was following in the footsteps of many people, going back to around the time of Christ. Jewish chronologies began around 200 BC. Christians began doing the same thing around 200 AD. But the problem is that that cannot be reconciled with any of the archaeology in the ancient Near East. And so that idea that these lifespans are face value numbers and that they can be added up to make a chronology doesn't fit. And like I say, when you look at it, it was began around the time of Christ, but that's a long time after Genesis was written. The question is not what did they think. It's about 1,000 years, depending on your view of when the Exodus was. And so if the question is not what did people think in the Greek-speaking culture around the time of Christ. The question is what did people think and how did they use numbers when Genesis was written? And what we find when we look at other ancient documents is that nobody created a chronology. Nobody used lifespans to add them together to make a chronology like Archbishop Usher did. Instead, what they did, the common method was to exaggerate the lifespans, to hyperbolically exaggerate the reigns of ancient kings or lifespans in order to give them honor. And so it's more authentic to read the lifespans in the Bible that way and not to use them to create a chronology.
So similar to the way the ancient Near East used the number 70 to represent the complete set or all of them or not one left out, that number being symbolic, I think most of us who've read the Bible will accept that that number is has a symbolic meaning, was not intended to be literally 70 or 7 times 10. There were other numbers that were used symbolically to represent the reigns of kings or the ages of various honored persons.
Correct, exactly. And so there are other numbers that are round numbers. 40 is used often, 12 is used often, the number 7 and 70 you mentioned. But in these lifespans, actually all of them you find out are part of a numeric scheme. All of them fit into, they're either divisible by 5 or divisible by 5 with the addition of the number 7. Now, there are some exceptions, and I believe I can explain why those exceptions are there. But, yeah, it really seems that the author of Genesis, I believe Genesis was written by Moses back in the time right after the Exodus, was using the common method at the time, the common technique that everyone in his audience would understand, of assigning these lifespans to give honor to these ancestors who were real people. And we have other examples outside the Bible of that happening, and that seems to make much more sense of the numbers that we have in the book of Genesis and later on.
And we see other examples from the ancient Near East of 70 being used in that way to represent all of them. Where else in the ancient Near East do we see examples of these numbers being used symbolically?
Yeah, great question. One of the best examples is the Sumerian king list. And now there are other king lists as well, but in the Sumerian king list, you have a very similar format to what we have in the Bible. You have a list of 8 or 10, depending on which list you look at, people prior to the flood with very long, and those were kings, and they have very, very long reigns. And it's not like the 900 plus years that you see in Genesis 5. These are reigns all around the number 36,000. So some had reigns of like 43,200 years or 36,000 years. And so clearly it's a hyperbolic exaggeration. Then they have the flood, and then they have reducing reigns of their kings down to more reasonable, normal reigns that we would think of when they get to the kings that they knew. Now, historians know that these kings listed in the Sumerian king list were real kings. So they're real people. And this was a way that the writer gave honor to their ancestors by exaggerating the length of the reign of their reign. And, of course, we know, and ancient Sumerians knew, nobody lives for 43,200 years. They knew this was a way to bestow honor. We have a similar thing. There's another king list, the Lagash king list. There's a similar format. The Turin canon in Egypt has some extended lifespans, although they're not talking about kings or ancient people. They're talking about semi-gods. But there are other ways that these numbers are used symbolically.
So then how do we process those, the ages of the patriarchs and the events that they took part in, Abraham's activities, the destruction of Sodom, the conquest of Canaan, alongside the archaeological evidence? How then do we reconcile those differences?
Yeah, so if what happens, if you take these numbers, these lifespans at face value, which Christians have done, like I say, for a long, long time, because literally that's what the text says. The text says Abraham lived 175 years, and then he died, at a good old age. And so the face value reading is, well, he lived to be 175 years old. The problem is if you take that at face value and you make a chronology, as many people have done, and Archbishop Usher is the most famous, that puts Abraham living at a time that you mentioned, around the year 2000 or before, when the events could not have happened. And the reason is because archaeologically, the cities mentioned in the Bible were not there. The biggest example is Jerusalem. There was a modest Jerusalem prior to 2500 BC, what we call early bronze, but then there was nothing there from 2500 to around 1800 BC. At 1800 BC, the Middle Bronze II, we have a walled city. And there's been lots of excavations in Jerusalem by lots of people. They've all, confirmed that. So if Abraham could not be living around 2000 BC because you don't have the city of Salem, you don't have Melchizedek, those events could not have happened. The only time they could have happened is in the Middle Bronze II, after 1800 BC. And so, once you realize that these numbers were never intended to make a chronology and were never intended to be taken at face value, then you can place the events of the Bible in terms of the archaeology, the history, and the social customs.
We'll talk more about the specific evidence then in our next program, but then I guess just to summarize, the way we as Christians who believe that the Bible is a true and accurate record of this supernatural conflict between God and those he chose to carry out his will, Abraham and the son of the promise, Isaac and Jacob and so forth, is by looking at the flow of history and saying when you line up the sequence of events that are recorded in the Bible with the sequence of what we see in the archaeological record, that actually meshes pretty closely, doesn't it?
Oh, I think it does. Absolutely, I think it meshes closely. Once Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, they fit perfectly in the Middle Bronze II period, post 1800 BC. The social customs fit, the type of treaties that Abraham makes, the price of slaves when Joseph is sold as a slave. All of that fits that era. That doesn't fit the earlier era. And all of the cities in the narrative are there and are in business. Jerusalem, of course, is the biggest one, but the other cities that Abraham visits. It's also much more plausible for Abraham to visit Egypt during the Middle Bronze too. That occurs in the story. And so it all starts to mesh together. It doesn't mesh together when you take these lifespans at face value. The
traditional view of Bible scholars over the years, until Dr. Stephen Collins began digging at el-Hammam back in 2005, was that the cities of the plain, Sodom and Gomorrah and their allies, were to be found southeast of the Dead Sea. The evidence that they have compiled and presented in that recently peer-reviewed published paper at Nature's Scientific Reports points to the site northeast of the Dead Sea, Tal el-Hammam, dated to about 1650 BC, give or take 50 years. Why does Tal el-Hammam, in your view, is that a better candidate for ancient Sodom than Bab ed-Dhra and the site southeast of the Dead Sea?
Yeah, that's a great question. And originally, people started looking in the southern end of the Dead Sea because of Dr. Albright. And he had looked around that area of the southern end of the Dead Sea. And at that time, the level of the Dead Sea was higher, and they were seeing some sort of bitumen or tar or something in that area. And he looked at Bab ed-Dhra and did not think it was the site of Sodom. He thought Sodom was underneath the waters at the southern end of the Dead Sea. And so everybody, because he's a respected archaeologist that all of us would, admire, people naturally looked at the southern end, and the only little towns down there are Bab ed-Dhra and Numera that people thought was Gomorrah. And then there are some other little towns there. But they're terrible fits for Sodom or Gomorrah. They're not on a plain. It's not well watered. I've been to Bab ed-Dhra. It's down on this big hill floating down. And in fact, some of it's even falling down into the ravine. So it's not. In Genesis 13, we know where Lot and Abraham stood, where they separated. It was near Bethel and Ai. We know they looked east. We know Lot went east. Tel el-Hammam is east, exactly there. ed-Dhra is south. It's not even close. And so it's the other thing is that ed-Dhra was destroyed around 2500, 2400 BC, 2300, something like that. It was a small village at best. A lot of its history, it was just merely a burial ground. And so, and the evidence of the destruction at ed-Dhra seems to be from an attack from other people. There are skeletons with skulls that are caved in, seeming like a blow to the head. It does not look like a fiery cataclysm from the sky hit this. Numera, the evidence there shows that everybody left the town before it was destroyed, which doesn't fit the story either. In the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, it's the sudden, cataclysm from the sky. And so those sites were never really all that good. They were off by at least 200 years being destroyed too early. They were not in the right place. They didn't fit the description. Now, Tel el-Hammam does fit the description. It's in a plain, or the biblical word kikar, a circle of the Jordan. It's to the east of Bethel and Ai. It was destroyed by this fiery cataclysm from the sky in that article you referred to. The biggest issue people have is that the destruction at 1700 or 1650 BC doesn't match up with their Assyrian-style chronology, which we've all grown up with. I grew up with that. I believed that. I even taught that earlier in my ministry because that's what the Bible seems to say if you take these numbers at face value and add them up together.
So in our previous program, you made reference to the evidence that Abraham is to be placed in the Middle Bronze II period, so that he would be a contemporary of the destruction of Sodom around 1650, 1700 BC, which, again, for most people who are adding up the ages of the patriarchs, that's about 200 years at least too late, and maybe even 400 years if you take the 400 years in Egypt as 400 years of the Israelites being in Egypt as a literal number as well. So what's the evidence then that the activities of Abraham could only have taken place in that period of time that coincides with the destruction of Sodom?
Yeah, and I mentioned earlier that the external evidence, the archaeological evidence, is that the cities that Abraham visits that are listed in the narrative simply weren't there around the year 2000. They weren't here until the Middle Bronze II age. The other external evidence, archaeological, if you want to say that, or anthropological evidence, is that we don't have any evidence of people living those kind of extended lifespans. All of the skeletons from the sites, hundreds and hundreds of sites, thousands and thousands of skeletons by Christians and non-Christians of all different, religious or non-religious persuasion. People live to be around 30 or 40 years old, not 175, and certainly not 950 like Noah or 969 like Methuselah. But the other evidence that I point to is within the Bible. And when you look within the Bible and take those numbers at face value, the narrative doesn't even make sense. If those numbers are face value numbers, then Abraham's wife Sarah is 89 or 90 when she's taken as a wife by Abimelech. And Abraham's claiming she's his sister. I'm like, 89 or 90? I don't think so. That's not a really worthy contestant for the Miss Abimelech contest.
Well, add that to the fact that, as you say, Jerusalem or Salem and the home city of Melchizedek wasn't even there. If we look at the earlier dates for Abraham, even the lower dates of say 1852, which is the number I came up with, 1852 BC. What was unique about Sodom? Why was Sodom such an important city in that period of time, and how did it compare to, say, Jericho, which is much better known to Bible readers?
Right, and this is where archaeology has helped us, and the excavation at Tel el-Hammam has brought an amazing amount of new information that we didn't know. Tel el-Hammam was by far the largest, the wealthiest, most prosperous, most significant city in the southern Levant for over 2,000 years. So the size of it, it's more than 10 times the size of Jericho.
Wow.
For example, it's kind of directly across the Jordan from Jericho, about the same distance from the Jordan River, yet it's more than 10 times the size. It's 5 times the size of Jerusalem. And so it's a very prominent city. And so then the scientific evidence shows that it was destroyed by a large cataclysmic event from the sky that completely wiped out everything within that basin area, that Kikar area, not just Sodom and the other cities of the plain that are satellite cities there, but also Jericho. Everything within that little plain there completely wiped out, and then nothing was there for over 700 years because the destruction was so massive that it even poisoned the soil. Nothing could grow there, and that matches exactly what we see in Scripture. That when Moses comes back to that same spot after the Exodus, then it's called Abel Shittim, and the plains of Moab are right there, that nothing's growing there. Nobody's living there. There's this huge city that had been the major city for centuries is not there. It's completely gone. And so that perfectly fits the narrative, and it's the place where that area is where Joshua sent the spies across to Jericho. They came back. It's where they went and crossed and marched around Jericho and began the conquest. And so once you see it lining up, the archaeology does confirm what we read in the Bible.
It's interesting that Sodom was an important enough city that the kings from the east, Chedorlaomer of Elam and his allies, were willing to march probably, I think about a 4-month march, if I remember correctly, across they didn't march across the Syrian desert. That would have been suicide, but they took the long way around and came down from the north.
Up and down, yeah, exactly.
Right,
yeah.
Came down the King's Highway. But when you look at the map and when you realize that the battle that took place against the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah took place north of the Dead Sea, suddenly the order of battle, the march of the kings from the east makes sense. They came down the King's Highway. They fought a battle against the Horites, the Hurrians, at the wilderness of El Paran, which is somewhere near Sinai. They fought at what is now Eilat or Aqaba. Then they came up the west side, fighting the Amalekites along the way. They fought the Amorites at En-Gedi. And then at the north end of the Dead Sea, they fought the battle against the kings of Sodom, Gomorrah, and their allies. That makes a lot more sense than the way we'd have to plot it out if the battle took place southeast of the Dead Sea.
Exactly, yeah. In the old view, with the southeast of the Dead Sea, they would have had to double back around to and of course we don't know, but it doesn't really make sense. It makes sense that they would continue north, and the battle would have been on the northwestern part of the Dead Sea, near where perhaps Qumran is today. And you can go there today, and the level of the Dead Sea has fallen to such an extent, and it was very low in the time of Abraham too. It's fallen to such extent you have these huge kind of beach areas, and what do you see in these beach areas? You have these sinkholes, which fits the narrative perfectly, because the people who fell into the sinkholes were the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah. They were obviously not fighting on their own front door, because nobody would do that. You don't fight a battle on your own front door. You go out somewhere so that, if you lose, they're not already in your city. And so they didn't know the territory. They didn't realize that they were going to fall into the sinkholes that are mentioned where the battle would have been fought. And they did lose, and Chedorlaomer did win, defeat them. He came back up, continued north to Sodom, Gomorrah, and to those cities. The Bible does not say he destroyed those cities at that time, and it wouldn't make sense for him to do that. Those cities had been paying tribute to Chedorlaomer for years. His job was to get them back in line. He would have wanted to keep them productive and keep paying tribute. So that's what he did. And he did take some Lot and some other hostages, and then, the story, Abraham goes and rescues them and comes back. So, yeah, absolutely, that location of Sodom fits much better once when you read the narrative that way. And like you say, look at a map.
So just to close out, to summarize here, when we read the archaeological discoveries and the evidence, and it doesn't quite fit the timeline or the dating that we have been raised with, how do we as Christians then process this? How do we counter charges, perhaps, that we're letting archaeology overrule the Bible?
Well, that's a great question. And people have asked me that question a lot. And the issue is you can't let one or the other. People say I'm letting the archaeology overrule the Bible. But we have to have them both. As evangelical Christians, we're saying the Bible is true in the sense that it corresponds to reality. And so what we read in the Bible should have some correspondence with what we see in archaeology and history. And so you need to have them both. Now, people say there are plenty of times when the Bible has been proven right and skeptics with their claims have been proven wrong. That's absolutely true. But that's only half the story. There's also plenty of times where science or archaeology has corrected an incorrect Bible interpretation. And so we need to be able to look at our interpretations of the Bible, even a cherished, long-held interpretation, in light of science and archaeology. And so this interpretation of that these lifespans were intended to create a chronology, as I mentioned earlier, that interpretation didn't occur until 1,000 years after Genesis was written. It was the first time anybody thought of that. Nobody made a chronology before that. When they wrote lifespans or reigns of their kings, it was to give them honor. They used hyperbolically exaggerated numbers. And so we need to look at our biblical interpretation. And it's not that the Bible's wrong. The Bible's always right. But sometimes our interpretation needs to be corrected. And oftentimes, archaeology has helped us correct that. And I believe this is one of those cases.
Dr. Craig Olson, Trinity Southwest University, thank you so much for your research and for your time today.
Oh, no problem. Thank you.
Interesting stuff. And I know that this is one of those topics that can really divide Christians, because when you start saying, there are explanations for these numbers that don't seem to make sense in the Old Testament. There are some people who just don't want to hear that because it appears to be questioning the authenticity and the supernatural origin of the biblical text. And again, that's not what this is about. It's just they used numbers and they recorded history differently 3,000 years ago than we do today. And so when we read into Scripture and try to say, well, the Bible's a bunch of myths and fairy tales because, look, this doesn't make sense per our 21st century worldview. We are trying to impose our modern expectations of scholarship on people who lived 3,000 or 3,400 years ago. Anyway, coming up, if we're not in the middle of a zombie apocalypse right now in the United States of America, I don't know what else you call this. I'll explain straight ahead on A View from the Bunker. Prepare for spiritual war by arming yourself with information. Take advantage of these specials through March that dig deep into the Bible to help you make sense of the chaos around us. First, our Veneration Bundle, our 2 co-authored books plus the travelogue DVDs from our Israel tours. An $85 value, just $45 plus shipping and handling. The Second Coming of Saturn Bundle, featuring my book and the 13-part companion DVD, a $50 value for just $35 plus shipping and handling. The This Is War special offer, featuring the Second Coming of Saturn, 4 DVDs, and 7 hours of audio interviews with Bible scholar Dr. Michael Heiser, a $145 value for just $75 plus shipping and handling. And the Gilbert Fiction Collection, all 8 novels in Sharon's Red Wing Saga series plus my 2 novels, a $200 value for just $140 plus shipping and handling. These offers are available through March only at our online store, gilberthouse.org/store. And again, we thank you for your prayers and support. Talking the walk every Sunday evening from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at VFTB.net. That is our global hub. Our main page for everything that Sharon and I do as part of Gilbert House Ministries is gilberthouse.org. Gilberthouse.org. A lot of these websites that we have are sort of grandfathered in. Back in the day, we thought we needed a separate website for everything we do. And so we've got like 9 different websites. Really, we should have just put it all under one central hub. But hindsight, 2020. Anyway, on social media, you'll find us at Twitter at View From Bunker or at Derek Gilbert. That's DEREK. Facebook, View From the Bunker. Truth Social, Gab Me We Get Her Parlor at Derek P. Gilbert. And if you're watching this tonight on YouTube, well, God bless you. Subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, but don't be surprised if some way we just mysteriously disappear because we say something or the powers that be there decide to go back into the archives and find something from the, 14 years that this program has been on the air to give them a reason to yank us off the air. So get ahead of the curve here. Protect yourself against unexpected deplatforming by downloading our free app. Our app brings all of our content into one place. You don't need to remember 9 different websites or subscribe to 5 different podcasts or anything like that. It's all right there on the app. This program, our weekly Bible study, the Gilbert House Fellowship, our weekly broadcast program, Unraveling Revelation, PID Radio, the podcast that started all of this, that is now back, plus our archives going back to 2005, including first interviews with people like Tom Horn, Dr. Michael Heiser, L.A. Marzulli, Steve Quayle, and many others now available in the archives. It's free, available for iOS, Android, Amazon, Kindle Fire phones and tablets, and you'll find a link at gilberthouse.org/app. You'll also find one in the top menu bar at VFTB.net. Zombie apocalypse. What will this look like? It is really bizarre that American preparedness agencies like FEMA and the Centers for Disease Control actually go out of their way to show preparedness tips for the zombie apocalypse. Now, I get they're trying to make people aware of the necessity or the wisdom of preparing for unexpected events by using a very popular entertainment trope, zombies, Walking Dead, or whatever, to get people to click and read. Say, hey, maybe we should have some water and some medical supplies and maybe some extra food around the house. We've been recommending this for years. People like Tom Horn and Steve Quayle, likewise, have been doing it much, much longer and better than Sharon and me. The wisdom of being prepared for the unexpected, because you never know. It won't be zombies, but it might be a tornado, a nasty winter storm, a hurricane, an earthquake, something like that. But there is what looks like a zombie apocalypse taking place on the streets of our major cities here in the United States. And this is horrific. I first became aware of this by accident. I was just on YouTube one night. Not that I spend a lot of time there, but just one of those videos that gets recommended to you caught my eye, and I clicked on it. I honestly thought, seriously, I honestly thought this was a viral marketing campaign for a post-apocalyptic zombie film. Until I read and I watched a few more videos from that user's channel and found that these are just street scenes from Philadelphia, city I lived in back in 1986 and 87 when I was working as a top 40 radio disc jockey on the air at night on Eagle 106. There were rough spots in Philly then. I arrived in Philadelphia in the summer of 86, which wasn't long after the city under Mayor Wilson Goode had bombed a cult group that had taken over a street, a block of row houses, and had fortified it, turned it into a fortress. And in frustration, I should say, the mayor authorized the police dropping incendiary devices that set the houses on fire, and a bunch of people, including some children, got killed. And we were taken on a tour of the city, drove past it. It's like, what happened there? Because they had just demolished the row houses. There was just a big hole where the homes had been. But things are worse now because of this new drug called tranq. The actual term is xylazine. It's an animal tranquilizer that is being mixed into street drugs. Started in Philadelphia and There's a YouTube channel out there. You can find it if you do a quick search. Zombies Philadelphia should bring it up. The Kensington neighborhood in particular is like an open-air drug market, and there are people walking around who literally look like the Walking Dead. Except it's worse than I realized when I first saw those videos months ago, because xylazine, which is being cut with heroin and fentanyl and other drugs, and because it's not an opioid, if somebody ODs on tranq, Narcan does not help bring this person back. Narcan is the overdose drug that's used for opioid overdoses. But this drug, while it causes whatever the high is that you get from this drug, it also causes open lesions, wounds on the skin. It makes it appear as though the flesh of the user is just rotting, like a zombie. So you've got a person with these open weeping sores that in some cases are so severe that the only cure is amputation. And it has spread from Philadelphia to other major cities across the United States. In 2021, the city of Philadelphia reported that 90% of lab-tested samples of illegal drugs found on the streets, 90% contain tranq. And now it's showing up in New York City, where about 25% of drugs there have been cut with tranq. That's according to the New York Times, and now it's showing that up in San Francisco and Los Angeles as well. So it is spreading. You have to wonder, because this is so debilitating. I mean, these people are just completely disconnected from reality. At least that's how it appears on the videos. And medically in peril, because these sores are now opening up all over their body. And they're so, again, detached from what they really need. Where, you and I wake up in the morning, body says, okay, I need air, water, food. According to one expert who works with addicts on the streets of Philadelphia, for them, it's like air, water, food, drugs. Need air, need drugs. They're not thinking about their medical conditions because of these sores that are opening up thanks to this animal tranquilizer. It's used as a veterinarian's toolkit, but it is not approved for human use. And if you've seen any of the pictures, you can find this on the web if you want to look at the stories. It is awful. So again, you've got people whose flesh is literally rotting while they're walking around in a daze like zombies. You have to wonder, given that so much of the fentanyl on our streets is coming from China, if this is not an effort to rot the United States from the inside out. I don't know this, I'm just speculating, but certainly if a foreign adversary wanted to weaken the United States to the point that we just could not respond to an external threat, this might be one way they would do it. Again, began in Philadelphia, appears to be spreading. New York City for sure. San Francisco confirmed it as well. Watch for this in other major cities. I don't know what the answer is here. Because, again, you're dealing with people who are in horrible physical condition, and yet they're still being told by their bodies, need air, need water, need the drug. There has to be a spiritual component to this as well. Well, coming up, we got a couple of virtual conferences to tell you about, but still waiting on final details on some of these. The Skywatch TV virtual conference for spring, I know, is slated for the month of April, so we should be close to announcing that here shortly. There's also Hear the Watchman virtual conference, and don't have that information in front of me either, but there is they did send out a mail list. So if you're on the mailing list for Hear the Watchman, the email list, you will have gotten information about that already. I did a presentation on the cult of Molech, which I'm sure would get them yanked off of most streaming video sites. Again, I've done that to them twice now with presentations because you know me, I'm just so, radical. I violate the community standards everywhere I go online, it seems. But anyway, that is underway now from Hear the Watchman. And we've got a physical conference that Sharon and I will be speaking at come July. The Go Therefore Conference, Dr. Mike Spalding putting this together. This will be July 28th through 30th, so mark your calendar for that. More details about other speakers still to come. And, of course, our tour of Turkey this fall, which was scheduled for October 17th through November 3rd, probably going to have to be pushed back just because the country there is reeling. And many of the sites that we wanted to see were in the areas hardest hit in the east and southeast of the country. So we will keep you posted on that. We appreciate you taking time out of your schedule, giving us a few minutes to listen or watch, wherever the case may be. And if you get a spare moment to leave a review at Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, or wherever fine podcasts are sold, we certainly appreciate that. Our announcer is D.C. Good. And A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House Ministries, released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives 4.0 International License. We wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.